All right, I think we are set to begin. Thank you everybody for coming out to today's panel titled Labor Unions and the Left. This panel is put on by University of Chicago Platypus. It's a student group on campus dedicated to investigating the history of Marxism and discussing politics. My name's Nick Kreitman. I'm a labor and employment lawyer in Chicago, U-Chicago alum, member of Platypus. Really excited to hear from our three panelists today. Let me introduce them to you, starting on the end of the table, farthest from me. Her name is Myra Janis. Is that?
Janis.
Janis, okay, my apologies. Myra Janis is a communist in the DSA. She's been involved with Cosmonaut magazine and was on the organizing committee of the Marxist Unity Group. In the middle, we have Les Slater. Les Slater was born into a working class family in 1943 in the middle of World War II. His father was a coal truck driver and members of the Teamsters Union. He originally identified as a Republican and voted for Barrett Goldwater in 1964. Les joined the United States Air Force and later volunteered to transfer to the Army to become a combat helicopter pilot. In 1964, he began questioning his support for the Vietnam War and American quote-unquote democracy, and while living in a hotbed of student radicalism in Boston, by 1970, he became self-described ultra-left anti-imperialist. In 1971, he sobered up to the futility of ultra-leftism and joined the Young Socialist Alliance, the youth group of the Socialist Workers' Party, and in May 1972, he was voted into membership of the party. And finally, we're honored to have Jorge Mujica. Born in Mexico, Jorge participated in labor and popular movements until he immigrated to the United States in 1987. He worked as a journalist for several newspapers, including Univision and Telemundo, and twice won the first place award for investigative reporting from the Association of Hispanic Publicists. He is one of the main organizers of the 2006 Immigrant Rights Marches and co-author of, Jorge, if you could give us the title of your book.
Migrantes, Migrant Voices.
Thank you very much. A book about the immigration movement. Jorge has unionized his own workplace twice and has worked and collaborated with several labor unions. He is currently a member of the National Council of the National Union of Writers and participates in several community organizations fighting for the interests of the Mexican community abroad. He was elected to the Mexican Federal Congress in 2021, representing the Mexican diasporas. Today's panel description. The left's present political downturn following the defeat of the 2020 Sanders campaign has seen the reemergence of unions as a prime political battleground. The left has hailed the recent founding of new unions in previously ununionized workplaces, such as Amazon and Starbucks. However, although the struggle for socialism was fought on the basis of labor, historically the relationship between trade unions and socialism has been ambiguous. Marxists in the past used the term trade union consciousness to describe the subjectivity associated with the advance of the immediate interests of the union, which was counterposed to socialist consciousness, the subjective prerequisite for revolution to transform society. Today we want to address why has labor unionism seen an apparent revival? How does the current apparent revival in labor unionism compared to past revivals, such as in the 1930s and in the 1970s? Why is it that historically labor has also been the basis of socialist organizing? How does the current labor union struggle advance or hinder the struggle for socialism? What should be the left's relation to unions? In addressing these questions, we've asked the panelists to prepare opening statements to respond to some of these questions raised in the panel description. We're going to have each panelist, starting with whoever wants to go first, address the introductory description. I may have a few questions based upon the initial presentations, and then we will open it up for anybody who wants to ask anything of our panelists and start the discussion. I don't think we have anybody, we're not doing the Zoom live chat today. Okay, perfect. Who would like to open up?
Go ahead, Liz.
Well, I guess I've been volunteered. As my introduction, I was born quite a while ago, nearly 80 years ago, in the middle of World War II. So my original politics, as I was beginning to grow up, the central question was the question of fascism. And that is, how could the German people have supported Hitler? As I developed to the point where I, 3, 4, 5 years old, I became very conscious and still remember that discussion going on. Now, I lived in a working class family, and so seeing what my father and my mother were doing, my father was a coal truck, well, originally a foundry worker, pouring metal into molds to make motorcycle engines for Indian Motorcycle, if anybody knows that. It's a long past brand. But it was in, that company was in my hometown, which is Springfield, Massachusetts. That's where Indian Motorcycle was, and my father worked in a foundry pouring castings for the engine. And then later on, that was a brutal job, by the way. His clothes didn't last more than a week. They would literally start falling off of him from the acid in the air. So that's sort of my experience in a very young life. But I don't want to dwell on my early years at the moment. What I want to do is go back to the 1930s and the rise of a general rise of the labor movement in the 30s, and particularly 1934, where the Teamsters, the Autolite workers, and longshoremen on the West Coast, mostly San Francisco. As it was stated, in 1972, I became a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, so I've studied some of the history of the party and of the labor movement. And in the Teamster strike in Minneapolis and St. Paul, the Twin Cities, there were some socialists, they called themselves Trotskyists at the time. There was 4 of them that were working in the coal delivery trucking industry. And another person who was a Republican voted for Hoover in 1928. He, under the pressure, as many workers, of the Depression, turned left. And by the time he was working in Minneapolis, he became attracted to the revolutionary forces that were there and became a leader of the Teamsters in Minneapolis. And there's a book that he was the author, a series of books. The first of the books is called Teamster Rebellion. And it's a seminal thing that many, many leftists read. But so I suggest that if you're not familiar with it, that would be a good place to start. But anyway, again, his parents were working class. His father worked for a coal company in the garage of that company. And in the 20s, many young people, like Farrell Dobbs was the person I'm talking about, leaned toward conservative politics and declared and worked toward Republican candidates. But as the class struggle unfolded, this is what changes people's political views and how they see the world and things like that. So political struggle, the class struggle, is an extremely important aspect of Marxism, for instance. If anybody here considers themselves Marxist or is studying Marxism, the class struggle is an extremely important aspect to it. And as a matter of fact, if you look at Marx himself, his Capital, which is everybody reads Capital, and there's other, the Communist Manifesto. I would make sure advise don't ignore the Communist Manifesto. That's directly talking to workers, and it's really good to have that. But Marx himself did a lot of analysis of the capitalist system, and he had to simplify things dramatically. And he pointed out that his findings, which became the Marxist analysis of capital, were trends. They were tendencies. They weren't a deterministic, you read the equations and you plug in the variables and this is what's going to happen. And Marx himself paid very close attention to the class struggle, particularly to major events during his lifetime. And that was the Civil War in the United States and also the Paris Commune in France. And in his many introductions to Capital, you can see how he changed his outlook based on his analysis of these particular struggles. So from a theoretical point of view, it's good to understand that, you read Marx, read Hegel, etc. But what you want to learn is the methodology to look at the class struggle and to be able to intervene and comment as appropriate or what abilities you have based on this knowledge, rather than going up to a worker and talking about Hegelian dialectics and things like that. You have to understand Hegelian dialectics. I mean, Marx did, Lenin did, and any serious revolutionary acquainted themselves quite deeply with things like Hegelian dialectics. Lenin, in his study of Hegel's logic, stated that after acquiring a good understanding of Hegel's logic, that for the first time he understood capital. And before that, he misunderstood capital. So this is a very important, from a theoretical point of view, is to look at the class struggle, and from looking at dialectics or Marxist economics, to keep in mind that these are trends. They were addressing particular issues at the time, especially Hegel coming, the French Napoleonic Wars, and how this was affecting society throughout Europe. This was the question. How come this is happening? This never happened before. It doesn't fit the logic that we learned in school. It doesn't fit the formal logic. So Hegel had to address this, explaining how society moved. And Marx in his young years was known as a young Hegelian, and he criticized Hegel for his idealism and his understanding of the relationship of reality to the spirit, for instance. And Lenin, who built a party in Russia that was mostly workers, and Lenin understood Marx. Lenin subsequently understood Hegel. But the main thing that one must keep in mind about Lenin is he directed his efforts at recruiting who could change society in Russia particularly, and that was the working class, and the Bolshevik Party was by far a majority of industrial workers. And so that's sort of a theoretical foundation that I would like to present, that class struggle and the working class, in addition to the higher level theoretical Marxist, Hegelian, or other subsequent studies of events that have happened since Marx or Lenin. So I want to go back to the, how much time have I?
About 8 minutes.
Okay.
We're trying to keep it around 10.
Yeah, okay. So basically I want to quickly hit the development of the labor movement from the 30s. And that is, in the early 1940s, the U.S. and before it actually entered the war, was gearing up for war. And the United States government, under the Roosevelt administration, attacked the most radical of the labor leaders, namely the Teamsters union in the Twin Cities, and the Trotskyists that were the leadership of that union, and used the Smith Act, which is a thought control law, to just put them in jail because of their positions of being against the war. And that was ultimately declared unconstitutional, and they were released. I don't know if that was before it was declared unconstitutional or not. But the main point is the ruling class, the capitalist ruling class, under the Roosevelt administration, was attacking the leadership of the unions and doing a cleanup of who was there. And they subsequently, over the years, the target was the most radical of the leaders. And then, and the war was over, there was a post-war economic boom, and the working class gained from a labor upsurge at the end of the war. But soon after that, there was a Cold War and McCarthyism and so forth, and again there was a serious attack on the leadership of the labor movement, to the point where by the end of the 50s, by the time McCarthyism was defeated, the labor unions were completely housebroken. So this is pretty much the situation we have today, is that the labor unions are tied to the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party represents a wing of the capitalist class that are ultimately our class enemy, the enemy of the working class. So I'm guessing I'm around 10 minutes. So,
Yep.
So why don't we leave it there? I have a lot more to say, but question and answer. Maybe other panelists could ask questions or so forth.
Sure. Thank you, Les. Who would like to go next?
I guess I'll go next.
I'm volunteering everybody here.
Yeah. So, honestly, being here today is kind of interesting for me because, and just in general, because of like sort of like the Platypus Society being so influenced by Trotskyism, and my sort of like organization drawing so heavily from like eminent critiques of Trotskyism done by our comrades in the Communist Party, Great Britain, PCC, Mike McNair, Jack Conrad, that sort of thing. And like it's that, and like the extent in which like Trotskyism has had like this almost unconscious influence on so much of the left. Like you wouldn't think it, just like sort of looking at like kind of like the organizations that are like popular right now on the left. It's like the DSA, PSL, that sort of thing. But like when you dig beneath the surface a bit more, you find that the influence is like very heavy almost. Like for example, with the PSL specifically, like its lineage can be traced back to the Trotskyist Sam Marcy, who founded the WWP, Workers' World Party. And that organization was like very active in the 70s and 80s and that kind of thing. And like the development of like sort of a global class war, as he referred to it, and like in efforts to like sort of like kind of do entryism into the new communist movement, allowed like sort of like Sam Marcy's organizations to gain like a following of like MLs, essentially rank and file MLs. So even with sort of like organizations descended from the WWP, like the PSL, like it still has that legacy of like being led by Trotskyists while also having like ML membership. And the DSA in particular also has like this really, really heavy influence of Trotskyism within it. Like a great deal of like our membership is made up of ex-ISO people who joined the organization after the ISO collapsed in on itself. And like sort of like them along with the DSA here are in charge of running the sort of like socialism conference that we have in Chicago. And that sort of thing. And we have like multiple Trotskyist organizations trying to do entryism into the DSA, like Socialist Alternative, International Marxist Tendency, and like probably a few others, honestly. But really the most pertinent like sort of influence that Trotskyism has had on the DSA in particular is sort of like its labor strategy, which is commonly referred to as the rank and file strategy. One of the major theorists of the rank and file strategy, or the major theorist of the rank and file strategy, is Kim Moody, and like he has a sort of like a relatively similar background to our dear friend here, of being like being a Trotskyist activist in the labor movement in the 70s, being very active during that time period and having like a relative working class background and that kind of thing. And I think like generally like the rank and file strategy is interesting because like this sort of influence of Trotskyism, it can be critiqued in a similar manner in a similar manner that Mike McNair critiques Trotsky's concept of the transitional program, because Kim Moody talks about this sort of concept of developing unions as transitional organizations and developing the consciousness of union members through the struggle, through the active struggle. And only then, when we develop like sort of like the consciousness of workers, only then we can start like sort of like spreading the seeds of socialism among them. But we can't go into the mines or factories or whatever, start talking about socialism, obviously, or at least according to Kim Moody. the sort of connection there is like a general fear of like engaging with the working class in an honest and straightforward way, essentially assuming that this kind of economism, that the natural sort of like progression of class struggle will eventually lead them towards socialism automatically, and that what is needed to be done is to simply encourage the class struggle enough, like through engaging with these kind of like unions, and pushing for union democracy to the point where, you know, they can break free and become organs of like communist class struggle and that kind of thing. Like Mike McNair like critiques like sort of like Trotsky's transitional program, in the sense that like it, you know, it assumes that because like we're in a period of crisis and that kind of thing, well, it was written during a kind of like period of crisis, World War II, and like the underlying assumption that Trotsky had was capitalism was on the edge of collapse. So pushing for these social democratic reforms would lift the class consciousness of workers to the point where they would be able to just like sort of like overcome their limitations and move towards socialism through these transitional demands. And in that sense, like it's just a general failure to like engage with workers in a more honest and open way, and it kind of leads to like tailism. You know, it leads to tailism of the Democratic Party, of activist NGOs, of that kind of thing, and like union leadership unintentionally, which is kind of why the rank and file strategy is so popular within the DSAs, because many people in the DSA want to feel radical, they want to do activism, they want to like do all that, but they don't want to harm their sort of like connection to the Democratic Party, and they don't want to make that breakaway. So just sort of being engaging in these sort of like economistic struggles of labor, you know, while like just like not really being that open about their socialism to their fellow workers or anything like that, allows them to like sort of maintain this kind of like distance from their own radical politics and like work within the existing system. And really, Marxist unity has like a kind of like opposite sort of approach to that in terms of like how we engage with like labor, the question of party, the question of the workers' movement in general. We want to put politics in command, to borrow the Maoist slogan. We want to like directly engage with the working class directly with socialism, with our platform that we're developing for the party of the future and that sort of thing. So in terms of like addressing the question of labor, it's a matter of like sort of like organizing the unorganized, which, you know, is extremely important given that unions, the current like total membership of unions across the country is around like 6%. So just doing union entryism will not address like sort of like the needs of like a workers' movement, of developing a workers' movement and that kind of thing. So it's like the rank and file strategy is inadequate for like the task at hand. It's simple union entryism. And much of like the left is focused on sort of entryism into already existing organizations, instead of like working towards building the party and that kind of thing. That's not to say we shouldn't be in like already existing unions. However, we have to be engaged in a process of like organizing the unorganized. Like these sort of campaigns with Amazon and Starbucks are sort of like an example of what is needed to be done, you know, in terms of reaching out and like specifically targeting like sort of like logistics, logistical capital as like a point of strength, that as a point where we can build up strength, since like the United States has gone through like so much in terms of like just this kind of like neoliberal offensive that happened in like the 70s and 80s, where like where the working class was weakened at like the point of production by like offshoring and like automation and like a sort of like political offensive against unions, that kind of thing. And like, so we need to like have like we need to rebuild the labor movement essentially from the bottom up, you know. We need to like sort of like organize the unorganized and like sort of you know, particularly focus on points of logistics in terms of organizing. And the only way to really meaningfully do this is in tandem with the development of a socialist movement, in tandem of developing a socialist movement. It is only through making that meaningful connection between the political, between the socialist movement and the workers' movement that we can actually sort of do this thing. And like sort of like rank and file strategy again assumes that we need to build up workers' consciousness before we can even tackle the question of having a party, of having a clear platform, of pushing our own politics first. It put first, when in like the sort of reality of our kind of like history, the history of the socialist movement is always labor developing in tandem with the socialist movement through its connection with the socialist movement. Like, for example, in the 1870s, like sort of like late, sort of like working, sort of like the workers' movement in Germany developed alongside the SPD. You know, it was through like sort of like advocacy of labor in the Prussian Parliament, advocating for labor and advocating against like war with France, that like this sort of like allowed for the labor movement to really develop in like Germany and that kind of thing, and it's just like, yeah. I guess that would be like most of what I want to address, but also I guess like sort of to like the final point, that like the sort of question on what should the left's position on unions should be. It feels kind of weird to talk about the left as like one cohesive sort of like subject that can like be brought about to do X, Y, and Z things, since it's like a diverse amount of organizations that all seem to quite despise each other and that sort of thing. I guess like it's like we can only sort of like you know, like sort of have like the left follow us, really. Like that's the only way we're going to get the rest of the left to do anything, is to follow us, for us to build the party, for us to engage in struggle within already existing unions, against bureaucracies, and like to build like the sort of like workers' movement and the socialist movement and merge them together behind and for the party and the eventual revolution. That's the only way that we're going to get the left to do anything. It's them following us as socialist revolutionaries.
Thank you.
Let's go back to the beginning. Industrialization brings up workers' organizing. And the first organizations of workers are for mutual support, mostly for health and safety conditions. Workers injured and killed in the workplace receive the solidarity of their peers, you know, for funerals or for times of sickness. Until somebody's got a brilliant idea that if working conditions depends on the employer, then the employer should pay for the consequences of those working conditions. Therefore, we get labor unions. And since 1850 to this day, the role of labor unions is to negotiate working conditions and nothing else. That's the primary and only objective of a labor union. Of course, a labor union may be more or less revolutionary, may be more or less leftist, may be influenced by or even promote political struggles. But mostly a labor union is an instrument to negotiate and bargain your working conditions. Somebody says to negotiate your slavery conditions. It's true. But every struggle for wages or for better safety conditions in the workplace bring up consciousness. Unless you bargain outside of your membership, I think. What's the difference between now and the 1930s? That we didn't have labor laws in the 1930s, basically. Unions were formations without a particular structure to follow, without having to comply with certain laws, without limitations in that sense, and heavily influenced by immigrants, European immigrants mostly, which were pretty well aware of the Russian Revolution and the Paris Commune and every other leftist ideology in the world. Immigrants, fortunately enough, brought those ideologies here pretty strongly. The massive influence of immigrants in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s brought unions to the United States in strength. I'm not dismissing 1886 and the May Day and high market affair, which was also, by the way, influenced by immigrants. 6 of the 8 leaders of the high market affair were immigrants, and they brought their ideals with them. But where are we now? Where are we now with labor unions? Why the 6 or 7 or 8%, and maybe in the public sector the 13 or 14 or maybe 16 or 17% of unionization? Because capitalism has made it quite difficult to just organize a union and fight and win and then negotiate and then learn in the process. It's brought it to an impossible situation. Unions nowadays have an incredible dependency on attorneys, of lawyers. If you don't have a lawyer, you don't have a union. You cannot protect your members if you don't have attorneys on staff. If you don't pay mediators $400 an hour, so you can grievance your problems because you don't have enough money. And I think that's a deterioration of unions, because unions were formed to fight, not to negotiate in the beginning. First, you have to present a struggle to be recognized, and then you have to present a struggle to bargain your collective bargaining agreement, to negotiate, and you need attorneys, and you need researchers, and you need I don't know what, in order to really comply. Any labor union, and this year, let me tell you, since 2005, there has not been that many union victories in the United States, January 1st to June 30th. So far, labor unions have won 660 union elections this first semester. But each one of these unions is going to take probably 2 years to 3 years to get their first collective bargaining agreement signed. That's a trap. That's a trap, but it's a trap brought up by, of course, the bosses, which have, implemented an incredible set of rules to be followed, and injunctions and this and that, and appeals and etc. And unions are being trapped in this pretty much set to lose scenario. But nevertheless, every struggle is an education moment. Even if you don't have a labor union, even if you only have at the beginning a group of organized workers fighting in the workplace for something. Starbucks unionization wasn't born out of the idea of a labor union to unionize Starbucks workers. And Amazon wasn't born out of the idea to have a labor union. It was to primarily defend and protect workers because working conditions and because of the pandemic. The pandemic is the responsible for this union wave, I think, along with another thing. You, people under 30, people who graduate, and the best scenario they face is to be a barista in Starbucks for a little bit more than minimum wage. That's reality for most of the people under 30. So there's no future. And if there's no future, what in the hell am I doing? Yeah? Do I want to be a barista for the rest of my life? And if I'm going to be a barista for at least 5 years, I want to have good and decent working conditions. And between the pandemic and the low wages, because wages stink nowadays, you know, the largest increase in wages in the last, 25 years or something like that is now. Wages have increased about 5%, but inflation is 8%. So we come out losing anyways. So between the lack of a future, I mean, what's the future? Amazon? Starbucks? Delivering pizzas? You know, what's the future? There's not a visible future like in the 40s or the 50s where you could say, yeah, you know, my whole family's been working at UAW, at GM or Ford, and, you know, members of UAW, and I'm going to be, you know, making a decent living. I'm going to be able to support my family. That future is not here. So all those elements, I think, conform what we see today as the situation of labor unions. It stinks on the legal side, it stinks on the structural side, but we had a pandemic and we have a lot of young people not willing to not have a life, you know, not have a future. What's the left doing? The left is trying to influence, and that's a big mistake, labor unions. And I mean a big mistake because instead of trying to influence Amazon workers or influence Starbucks workers, the left should be organizing their own workplaces. And that's why I put in my bio, I have organized my workplace twice. I organized the union in Univision, Chicago, and I organized my own union in El Fondo de Cultura Económica, the largest editorial house in Mexico. And I have collaborated to unionize so many workers here in this town, you know, in this city. So many, by the thousands, really, honestly. But the left is not doing that. The left is trying to influence labor unions. The left is trying to, let's move labor unions into socialism. Let's move into, it doesn't work. It has not worked before. It doesn't work today. The big industrial unions in the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, were organized by the Communist Party, but not from the outside. They were organized from the inside by having communists, you know, people, individuals convinced of communists organizing their own workplaces. Problem is that this economy is not prone to organize a lot of people in many places because we now have, you know, the gig works, gig jobs, and everybody seems to be in a gig job. Uber and Lyft and I don't know what other delivery companies and non-profits, the whole non-profit complex, and everybody seems to be working in the left in this kind of jobs. Nobody's working at a factory, nobody's working in an industry, few are working in a very big restaurant that has like 40 people that you can unionize. I'm not talking about a taco joint with 3 workers. I'm talking about a big workplace where you can organize. That's a problem. Of course, we come to the university not to be a taco waiter. We don't want that job. But then what do we do as left? I think the relationship between the left and labor unions would be of support in the picket line, of support in the struggle, by helping create the leaflets, by helping promoting discussion, but within the labor union. We are not labor union organizers. We don't work as organizers for any labor union. Yeah. No, we don't. I mean, maybe we should try looking for a job, as an organizer in a labor union. They are hiring. They are hiring because they are absolutely incapable of organizing now. The new national president of the AFL-CIO says the goal is to organize 1 million workers in 10 years. That stinks. 100,000 workers per year among 585 national unions. That's like 2,000 workers per union. Give me a freaking break. Yeah, that's absurd. That's absolutely impossible. So we live in a contradiction. Many labor unions are incredibly corrupt. I organize workers into labor unions, and 1 year later I receive a lot of complaints from those workers I helped organize into labor union about their labor union. Yeah, but that's a learning process too. Because, as I used to tell them, if you join a soccer club, a soccer team is not to sit on the side and look at who kicks the ball and criticize them and say, hey, that guy doesn't know how to kick the ball. Is to participate and kick the ball, get in the field and kick the ball, and learn how to kick the ball. And unfortunately, labor unions have not and are not teaching their workers anything. Their dependency on attorneys and laws and compliances and union dues have made them incapable of facing the times. We have an incredible resurgence because workers themselves are starting to organize, and then a labor union comes by and says, I will help you. But it's not because labor unions design organizing. SEIU, the largest union in the United States, put millions and millions of dollars into the fight for 15 and didn't organize a single worker. Didn't organize a single McDonald's, didn't organize a single Dunkin' Donuts, didn't organize anything. But of course, it was a learning moment. It taught workers to fight, and that you don't even need a union to go out on strike, because dozens of McDonald's went out on strike, 2-hour strike, 1-day strike, 2-day strike. Yeah, it's a teaching moment. That's fine. They poured millions and millions of dollars into non-organizing, but influencing public policy. And then they put more millions of dollars into Democratic Party candidates that don't deliver. Of course. So what do we do as left, as individuals and as organizations? We have to support unions, we have to support unionization, and we have to criticize them. Of course we have to criticize them, but we have to help them, because they are useless in so many ways. Yeah, I think we can give them something. I think we can learn a lot from them, of the nuts and bolts of organizing. What does it mean to have a union versus not having a union in the workplace? We have to promote unionization at the same time as we criticize them. So we have to support TDU, and we have to support a new democratic movement in the UAW, which is about to carry a one member, one vote national election. And I wouldn't be surprised if it happens to them, the same thing that happens to the Teamsters, where a TDU alliance was able to take over. Yeah, that's a good sign. Not bad. Unfortunately, at the National AFL-CIO, that didn't happen. Sarah Nelson, the president of the airline workers, didn't have a chance to become the national president. She's a DSA member, by the way, but didn't have a chance of becoming the National AFL-CIO president. Because you have to fight against structures, you have to fight against corruption, or you have to fight against cliques, gangs, and a whole lot of other things. But let's not forget, labor unions are not an instrument for the revolution, for any revolution. They can participate, they can educate their members, they can move people to do something. Mostly they move it to support the Democratic Party, unfortunately. But they can move people to do something against the war, for green, cleaning, environment, and some other issues. They can move it. And those are pretty advanced movements, I think. So critical support, but support, that's what we have to do. And learn alongside with them instead of just trying to, illustrate them and influence them. That, I think, unfortunately, doesn't work. If it did, unions would be socialist tools, for socialist parties. But that doesn't happen. Thanks.
So I'd like to hear your response, Les, to Jorge's comments, because I think there's a conversation to be had there between some of the positions Jorge's outlined regarding the non-instrumentality of labor unions for leftist politics. And that seems to be in tension with your articulation of union organizing being some sort of genesis of class consciousness that seems to be the kind of lifeblood of, the great minds of Marxism that you reviewed earlier. So what would your response be to Jorge? And maybe I'm simplifying it too much, and maybe there's more agreements.
You're phrasing it pretty well. First of all, none of this is simple. We're living in a very complex environment. The contradictions, Jorge brought up a lot of them, some very, very fundamental, like depending on lawyers and depending on things like that, are serious, serious, serious problems. But this is deliberate, that the leaders, quote unquote, in this case, are very conscious of this is what they want to do. And basically, they understand this is taking away the power of the rank and file workers, putting it in hands of really their class enemies. I mean, who are these lawyers? Really, who are they? They're not workers. They're not part of the industrial class. They don't see themselves as defending workers. They see themselves getting a salary. They see them.
Except for Nick.
There's. No, but you're not part of this machine. You are not. But there are people that are very highly paid. My son works as a bus driver. He's an executive board member of the ATU 241 here in Chicago. And he's at odds with all the leadership. His whole board, besides him, the president of the union in Chicago, all the top executives in the international, they are very consciously trying to prevent the working class that they represent, the workers they represent, of having a say in how the union will go. They are beholden to the Democratic Party. They're beholden often to the bosses themselves. Like here in Chicago, and this is any place, at the CTA and the ATU 241, the top leadership of the union is basically in bed with the management of the CTA and the city administration of Chicago. This is deep. It's not like accidental or anything else like that. And the lawyers, they all talk to each other, and when a supposedly union is fighting for a worker's rights, you will have both union lawyers, CTA lawyers, and city lawyers getting together and deciding how to screw the worker. I mean, this is concrete reality. Now, on the complications, one of the things Jorge said is even when workers fight and win and gain contracts, whatever percentage, inflation is higher than that, so they're actually moving backwards. Well, the Fed, the head of the banking conglomeration in the United States, it's the Fed, they are saying very vociferously that their priority is to knock down the inflation. Well, if you look closely, if you read the Wall Street Journal, Barron's, New York Times, and so forth, there's an interesting debate going on. One of the, and the United Nations is saying, hey, stop, please. This is killing our economies. The debate going on, some of the language I'm reading is they recognize that the fighting of inflation, to the extent that it works, is going to cause pain. And this latest New York Times article I read said very bluntly, this pain means workers out of work. And, why are they continuing this way? Why don't they find some other solution to inflation? There are other solutions. And, the ruling class admits these type of economic solutions are crude, but they go forward with them anyway. And from what I read, and it's sort of in between the lines, reading all the press, is there are certain sectors of the ruling class that want the working class to be unemployed. Now, this basically puts, from their perspective, it puts the the ability to organize in a more difficult situation. And the old thing, the boss says, well, if you don't want to work on these conditions or this pay, there's 100 people.
Yeah.
They're in a line outside. You just look out the window. I'm being a little bit exaggerating here. But I want to make a couple other clarify some things. One is I haven't been in the Socialist Workers' Party for many, many years, since the 70s, but I am presently a supporter of the Socialist Workers' Party and think they have the right line. The other thing is, for quite many years, the Socialist Workers' Party has not considered itself Trotskyist. And the reason for that is, the reason they were Trotskyist is because there was a degeneration of the Russian Revolution in Russia, where the communists, where the working class was very severely injured in the Civil War, where 90% of the industrial workers were killed. I mean, literally, 90% of the industrial base of the Soviet Union was destroyed by the Civil War. So what left us with is a situation where people who didn't support the revolution decided to join the party, the Bolshevik Party, and Stalin was the secretary and just welcomed all these people in. And basically, there was the party became ossified, bureaucratized, and the party basically operated in the interest of that layer of bureaucracy, opposed to the working class in general, and had to brutally enforce that because workers could see it. So there was a lot of purges, a lot of people killed, and all that sort of thing. The other thing, so the Trotskyists basically called themselves Trotskyists to distinguish themselves from people calling themselves communists. And the people calling themselves communists were Stalinists, and they were representing a layer that was usurping the energy of the usurping the working class for their own personal purposes. So we called ourselves Trotskyists, but with the fall of the Soviet Union, which we praised, we decided that we no longer have to distinguish between somebody calling themselves communists because people stopped calling themselves communists. People like Putin, for instance, the last thing he wants to be seen as is a communist. And this is true of this whole layer. They wanted to scramble, get businesses and everything else like that. So we don't call ourselves communists anymore. I mean, Trotskyists. The other thing is, I don't consider myself part of the left at all. Just think about the discussion of the left here. The left should do this, the left should do that, we should influence the unions, we should have them follow us in our ideas. In my opinion, that's a bunch of bullshit. What needs to happen, one of the things that's going to happen is the American capitalism, as well as capitalism throughout the world and world trade, is in a crisis situation and deteriorating. Things are getting much worse, and they're going to get much worse for the working class here. And workers will fight. They will find a way to fight. And anybody that's interested in the working class and revolution, as Jorge says, they should be going to those picket lines, and maybe you said that, going to the picket lines primarily to learn what the workers' concerns are, what their tactics are, what successes, what failures they've had. Learn that and understand that a particular industry is different than some other particular industry. So no one size fits all type of thing. But the other thing besides ourselves learning, anybody that wants to push the idea that we need to change society, we can't live with capitalism, what we need to do is when these fights break out and we learn from them is we spread the word. When we're on another picket line, we say, these people over there on a picket line, you should join them. But this is their view. We have a newsletter explaining their views. Not explaining Hegel's triads or anything else like that, but what these workers are facing and how they're reacting to it. So this is primarily what anybody that thinks along revolutionary lines, thinks they might be part of this, should be thinking. First of all, get a job, and second, whether or not you get the job, and the job helps because you understand. You see, you're on a picket line and say, I'm from such and such, and they say, yeah, what's it like there? So you tell them. You may not be on strike, you may not be in a struggle, but you're on the line, and you know what you face as a worker, and you can empathize with these other workers. But the main thing is to learn from the workers and spread the word. Develop a newsletter, develop a newspaper, and for a start, I would suggest reading the Militant newspaper, which is the paper of the Socialist Workers' Party. It's not aimed at students, it's not aimed at intellectuals, it's aimed at workers. But the issues that are discussed are quite important issues and quite often controversial. So anyway, that's my little point.
So I'd like to bring in Myra. I have two comments, and I'm going to play devil's advocate here based on your introductory remarks.
Okay.
Let's say hypothetically we have a group, we call it Democratic Socialists for Unions of America. We have a certain amount of members, and we want to have one of these interventions? You were discussing we need to have some kind of intervention, possibly in logistics. What would your response be to the recent PRO Act vote that was 2 votes off from radically changing labor law in America? Suddenly you now have, all kinds of damages. The law has teeth. Maybe you get card check neutrality. A lot of benefits. Within the framework, the legalistic framework now, I would anticipate at least a 10% growth in the number of members. Would be substantial compared to organizing gains that have been made recently of a few Starbucks stores and a single Amazon warehouse. What would your response be to DSUA going and trying to pressure the 2 Democrat votes to make sure that bill passes? Why would is that something that might be considered by Workers' Unity as some sort of strategic intervention? And what could you flesh out more? I mean, the relationship between the Marxist Working Unity group, or the project you're associated with, and intervening in union struggles, which are essentially, mediated through the Democratic Party in our current framework.
Right. That's like, I guess like one of the things that we're pushing for with Marxist Unity and the DSA is sort of like disciplining our elected representatives and making sure that they can be held accountable by the DSA itself. And I guess in terms of like engaging in an intervention there, getting the votes for that, it would have to involve like sort of like pushing the DSA to discipline those 2 Democrats, essentially. It would be pushing them, or pushing, if they're not DSA members, then trying to push them out, primary them with DSA members, since currently we don't have the party yet, but we can still engage in electoral discipline because like the sort of like DSA Democrat candidates that we elect generally rely upon the DSA to do their groundwork, to be a part of their campaign and that sort of thing. And that gives us a decent amount of power when it comes to like deciding their decisions and that kind of thing. Sort of like pushing them to have the positions of what, a more organized and more powerful DSA. That would be the intervention that we can make, is through that.
My second question, why logistics? Assuming that the $15 an hour you would make at an Amazon warehouse is as good of American money as the $15 an hour you could make, selling tennis rackets, in a retail store, or earning it as a coder, $100,000 a year as a coder. What's special about logistics, and why would that be a target for a left? Is it because it's some kind of pressure point politically that, affecting the chain of commerce? What's the thinking there?
I guess, well, it's like you have to fundamentally kind of like make up for like the position that that labor is currently in terms of like in the global core, which is specifically like there's less like sort of like workers at sort of like the point of production within the United States. There's less workers at the point of production. And like the power that the labor movement draws just generally on its own is through its ability to strike, and like affect the production of commodities. If you like sort of like have that same sort of stranglehold on logistics, the flow of commodities, which the sort of like economy of like global core nations is like more dependent on now, like you could have sort of like the same ability to like be seen as a threat when you strike. It's through that you would like sort of like be able to rebuild the strength of the labor movement. Sorry if that wasn't...
So the strike in logistics would be demonstrative to other workers?
Demonstrative?
Yeah, like it would demonstrate the power?
Yeah, it would demonstrate the power. Yeah, it would demonstrate the like sort of like the power of like workers, not only to other workers, but to like sort of like the capitalist class, which, you know, sort of in the core doesn't really take labor very seriously, except for like kind of in this current moment when there, you know, it's just like there is like stirring of a labor movement, even though, and like sort of like unions are more popular now than ever, even though their membership is relatively low in the general public. They're more popular now than ever, and it's primarily through the political interventions that has come about, really, I believe. It's through like the popularization of union efforts by like kind of like the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016 and 2020 that we are like seeing this sort of like positive spin on unions. And like, again, it's like it goes back to my point about trying to put politics in command. You have to engage with these sort of, you have to build up the labor union through creating the environment politically for it.
And Jorge, if you could, I'd like to ask you what the conception is beyond the legalistic framework here, because we have historical examples such as many Teamster trucking contracts that didn't end up in arbitration before lawyers. They ended up before a grievance panel. And, you know, depending on who paid Jimmy Hoffa more, that would, you know, sometimes resolve the grievance. But ultimately, they could strike if there wasn't an agreement with the grievance committee. Do you think that kind of model is realistic in a situation where the bargaining power of today's unions is so small? How would you understand or transition into that without having some kind of legal framework, you know, that might be socialist, you know, where there would have to be some kind of left political intervention on top of, you know, just organizing workers? Because it's one thing to organize about an OSHA violation and take action, which is legally protected, but it's another thing to have a walkout over wages or something, you know, at one of these stores, at another store, even if it was across all Starbucks. You know, that seems to me to require the kind of political organization and class consciousness or something that I've sort of asked about to the other panelists that might require some kind of leftist intervention into unions.
It does, I think. The ideology driving a union organizer or a labor organizer, because not all labor is unions. You know, the labor movement is a lot more than labor unions. Labor unions are the organized part of the labor movement, but there's labor movement all over the place. Agreed. The Fight for 15 strikes taught people a lot. The idea that you can strike came back, you know, to the reality, the present reality, because for the longest time, labor unions signed in every collective bargaining agreement a no lockout, no strike clause. It's not mandatory, but they do sign it, except the IWW in what's the cafeteria workers they organize?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you know. Can't remember the name exactly, but IWW, the International Workers of the World, signed a collective bargaining agreement that does not say that you cannot strike. Other than them, every collective bargaining agreement says you can't strike. You have to go to grievance and arbitration eventually, but you can't strike. The Fight for 15 didn't have a union. They were not union workers. They didn't have collective bargaining agreements. Therefore, they went out on strike. And that was a big lesson for so many people. And if you get a group of workers willing to do something and they are not covered by a collective bargaining agreement, then you can revive the idea of strikes. Let me tell you a story. You might have seen it because most likely the tortillas you eat come from El Milagro. El Milagro tortillas. Okay. El Milagro is the largest tortilla factory in the city of Chicago, about 3.5 million tortillas a day. It's got, it's a lot of tortillas. It's got 450 workers, but it used to have, before the pandemic, 600 workers. So there's an incredible, lack of workers. They are desperate. But their wages are so low that they couldn't hire anybody. People who left during the pandemic, 85 people sick, 5 workers dead. They couldn't get more people to replace the ones that were leaving. And they decided to offer $16 an hour wages to new workers when they were paying $5.15 workers to current workers, to people who have been there for 10, 12, 15, and 20, and one incredible case of 32 years working at El Milagro for $15.50, meaning 15 cents above minimum wage. And the workers got pissed. How come the company is going to hire somebody and pay them more than they are paying me? And we had a meeting with 6 workers. That was our first meeting. The second meeting had 45 workers. We gave them a letter to demand higher wages. 119 people signed the letters. They delivered the letters, and they got a wage increase in the following Friday. And then the next plant, that happened on 36th Street, and the next plant said, hey, how come they get wage increases and we don't? So we met with them, and they decided that they wanted another letter. 96 people signed in the second plant. And then the company went nuts, and they started making public that external agitators were coming into the plant to, disrupt the process of making tortillas in the city of Chicago. We were laughing like crazy because it had been like 30 years I had not been called an agitator, an external agitator, paid by the gold of Moscow or something. I don't know. That was fun. But the workers in the second plant didn't get the increase because the company said, no, wait a second. It's one thing to give it to one group of workers in one of the plants, and another thing is to give wage increases to everybody in the company. That's not the purpose here. So the workers decided to do a work stoppage. They went out on strike. They went out on strike for 4 hours, previous notification to the employer, and they did it. And that prompted the tortilla revolution in Chicago. Thousands of people supporting, thousands of people actually, funny enough, declaring a boycott the workers did not call for. We posed the question to the workers, do you want to, the public to boycott the El Milagro? And they said, no, we don't think that's appropriate. But the public themselves did. The public, because they said, these workers, this and that. We had massive demonstrations. We had press conferences with 19 media outlets. 19 media outlets is a lot of media outlets, Well, to make the story short, 1 year and 1 month later, since the beginning of August of last year, these workers have won $2.3 million in wage increases. The company is backing off or backing down, I don't know English enough, on so many of their internal policies. They are giving uniforms to the workers after years of making the workers pay for their own uniforms, etc., etc., etc. So what do we have today? We have a group of workers without a labor union because no union stepped forward and said we will organize them. They still don't have a union. They won't have a union in the near future. But we have a group of workers, 450 decided workers, that learn that they can stop the factory, that learn that they can earn their wage increases and without the need of a single lawyer. Well, we got one for a sexual harassment lawsuit. But other than that, It's been complaints with the NLRB, it's been complaints with the Department of Labor, it's been complaints with the Office of Labor Standards, for which you don't need a single lawyer so far. So far, we have not used any lawyers. But yes, you need an external agitator, a communist, working in a worker-centered non-profit organization to prompt these workers and to tell them and to orient them and to, knowing a little bit of labor laws, tell them what's possible, what's feasible, what's not. And you have a team of dedicated people to promote the struggle, savvy in the use of the media, which is something labor unions don't even know, because there are 3 strikes every day in the city of Chicago we never know about. Yeah, and instead, this struggle at El Milagro got the more publicity of any labor struggle in Chicago in the latest years. So it's a combination of facts, I think. It's the laws are there, unavoidably. On November 8th, we will have the opportunity to vote for a constitutional amendment in Illinois to prevent Illinois from having any right-to-work laws. The opposition says that's useless. Who wants to do that? Nobody. It is not necessary to amend the Constitution. The proponents said, yeah, we better do it because 27 states in the United States have right-to-work laws. So we have to work around laws. We have to use laws. We have to teach laws to the workers. I think that's one of our main tasks. How many here know how many labor laws we have in the United States? Who here know what your rights in the workplace are or not? Well, workers don't know either. And most employers don't know either, and that's why they get attorneys. We would need attorneys otherwise. But it's an incredible complex of elements that we have to circumvent and go around. And yes, if we get a union labor organizer that doesn't have an ideology, revolutionary, left, communist, socialist, I don't know what, then you don't go anywhere. And I completely agree with Les. The big leadership of unions know what they are doing. They are, keeping the working class in a non-struggle status. That's all they are good for, definitely.
We'll open it up to anyone who has questions for the panel.
Thanks. Thank you all for presenting. I was just kind of thinking about, I think it was something you had said last, kind of the importance of going to the strikes, the workers' organizations, and learning from them, and then kind of taking that and putting it into published works, and then kind of spreading that and stuff. And so my thought is, along with learning with someone who calls themselves a communist, a socialist, would any representative from an existing communist left group, would they have anything to offer the movement? Or do we have anything to teach or offer from the outside to the workers, say, at the picket line? Or is our task mostly to learn and then pass that on?
If I may go first.
Yeah.
We can give an incredible support to labor unions because labor unions don't do much. Education, and what do I mean by education? As Les was saying, don't come around trying to discuss Proudhonism. How can a worker know how much money is the factory making? What's the revenue of this company? A worker doesn't know how to do that, but you may. It's not that incredibly complicated, even if it's a private industry. You can find out. You can Google. The workers can't, really, honestly, can't Google. They don't know the codes to Google. But you can do it. And we can tell, we told the workers of El Milagro, In 2020, first year of the pandemic, El Milagro made $435 million. Meaning, if you have 450 workers, pretty much each one of you produced $1 million for the company. Deduct cost and whatever, and guys, you should be making $250,000 each one of you. And that is collaborating. That's educational. You don't have to be Marxist to do that. Of course it helps a lot, but you don't have to. But that's a simple way to help. The basics of the law, concerted protected activity. You can do that. So there's always ways to help, I think. The worst case scenario is labor organizers without ideology, because labor organizers without ideology only go by the structure, do this, do that, 1, 2, 3, and they don't teach anything, and workers don't learn anything, because the struggle is taken away from them. Workers don't learn how to fight for their collective bargaining agreement. They only learn to delegate to the negotiator, and you can come in there and say, hey, these are the main points to be negotiated. This is what you can do, and you can organize your own discussion committee, your study circle, on your own collective bargaining agreement. Help them interpret the collective bargaining agreement, because once attorneys get in the way, everything becomes legalese and nobody understands anything. So I think we can all do it. We don't have to be experts on anything, and we don't have to be attorneys, and we don't have to be decided socialist, Marxist, socialist, etc. Those are common sense things. But our level of academic instruction allows us to do something workers don't have access to. And we can cooperate all the time, I think.
Any other? You had a hand up, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say. So you were pointing out, adding on this, you were pointing out, the 5 for 15 was instructional, for people, just working. You also pointed out, how, for example, people in, the SWP, for example, handing out, the militant with it's there was this different.
It's an example.
Yeah, there was this different strike that happened over here, and it's these victories were had for these workers, and it's couldn't a similar thing happen in your workplace? So I have I want to sort of add on what you just said, and then sort of ask again why does there need to be a communist at all? For example, my friend, before he left Chicago, organized his workplace. He's not a communist. He just wanted to make money, and it was successful. He didn't need a lawyer or anything. He didn't need a union. Now, it seems like you're basically just pitching people who are communists are the more advanced people in the workplace, but it seems like they're only advanced in purely administrative tasks, things you could just hire a lawyer for. So I don't actually see why in that case there's actually any benefit. It seems like it's actually more of a hindrance than a help to have someone who would call themselves a Marxist as a head unionizer, in that sense. The other thing I would say is you say that people are learning stuff from you say they're actually learning things from the 5 for 15, and maybe they are at an individual level, they're feeling it. But what does that mean for actually just down the road when they're just working somewhere else and maybe they are making more money and it doesn't really matter anymore? Where's the receptacle for that lesson to actually be learned? Just in general. What's something that actually 15, 20 years from now, that lesson could actually mean something aside from just immediate, the immediate feeling that it's oh, this was useful for an individual or something? How could people in the future actually receive that information and actually be able to do something with it?
Well, the question of communicating in general is a fairly complex one, and it depends a lot on common experience. That when I say something, you are listening, but you're not depending on just what I'm saying. You have some experience, you have ideas, etc. And this you use to decipher what I'm saying. It's never in a vacuum. I mean, what I'm saying is not in a vacuum. So a key here is understanding some of the fundamentals of what workers face. Low wages, dangerous, etc. So when you talk, like when the Bolshevik Party talked about bread, peace, and land, those are just 3 words, but it meant an awful lot to people that heard those 3 words, and it was much more complex than those 3 words. So when you talk to a worker, after a while, you start to understand what the workers are talking about. And you can relate, especially if you're a worker also, you can relate to them your understanding of what they're saying. Say, yes, I understand what you're saying. I experienced this, my other coworkers or comrades or whatever experienced this in this job. And taking this and in an intelligent way, writing an article that the next time you speak to, you're at a picket line, you select articles that may address some of the issues that these particular workers are dealing with, and you hand it out, and it's a process of you learning as a supporter of the working class, and it's also a process of the working class learning. I mean, one of the big things, my son was just at a international convention of the ATU, and the president got up and he had everybody stand up, that the union locals stand up, the ones that were on strike that year. And he went, he says, I was on that picket line. This is the union, international union president. And my son reported on this, and what the union is not doing is the president went to a struggle when the struggle broke out and supported it, but did not publicize that particular struggle to other members of the Amalgamated Transit Union, and did not mobilize workers from nearby locals to join these things. He was there, and there are people with cameras, of course. And so he's increasing his credentials, but his duty, or a duty of any leader, should be to spread it, to increase the power of these workers that are on strike, and to show others as an example. And they consciously don't do that.
Well, it seems like here the question is less of dissemination of information, but more of organization itself. So the question is, what organization is actually capable of actually keeping this kind of like history of like defeats and victories, and actually being able to disseminate that? Because it's not just, it doesn't seem to just be like, I need to write an article and hand it out to people.
Okay, let me give the example of the Socialist Workers' Party. A big example of what the Socialist Workers' Party claims is what they call the revolutionary continuity. And this involves 2 things. One is that James P. Cannon was one of the people that predates the Communist Party in this country, but he was one of the founders of the U.S. Communist Party. He got expelled in 1928 for supporting Trotsky's position on the China question, along with others, and they formed an organization called the Communist League of America, and then they were involved in some of the labor struggles, and they merged with other parties, the Workers' Party and things like that. And in 38, there became the Socialist Workers' Party. But the other thing is they document these things. In the struggles themselves, there's all kinds of notes and so forth, and they publish. They have a publishing house that very consciously publishes revolutionary history, what the working class has done at various stages, including pointing to, at least, they don't necessarily print Lenin's collected works or Marx's collected works in correspondence or whatever, but they point to them. They point to various things and they say this is what you should be studying if you are to understand the lessons from current struggles. And in the struggles that the party itself has been involved in, like the Teamsters in the Twin Cities, and the Boston busing struggle in 1974-75, these things are documented. So whenever there's a struggle, you can point. Somebody comes into a bookstore and they start asking questions, and every question they have, you can point to a book and say, this will address this question, what you're answering. And then they ask another question, you say, this book addresses that. Or, you can read Education for Socialist bulletin or whatever. So these things are part of the education of the class. You sell books, you sell papers to workers in struggle, and then as you recruit workers, any workers that decide that they want to go beyond their individual circumstance and help other workers, you recruit them and educate them to past struggles and methodologies and history.
So I'm interested in hearing all three panelists' answer to this. So if any or all of you have comments, feel free.
Can you speak up?
Sure. So I'm interested in all three panelists' comments on this. So if any of you sort of have something to say, feel free. But I think a lot of what's been discussed are questions on labor where the interests of the left and the interests of workers or laborers coincide. But as Jorge mentioned, a lot of present labor movements sort of manifested out of the pandemic. And I think one sort of contentious issue is the question of working at home or lockdowns. And that might be an instance where the left and workers might have conflicting interests in terms of the question of building movements to a certain extent requires the coagulation and interaction of individuals. So I guess my question is not sort of is working from home good or bad or anything like that, but how should the left relate itself to laborers in questions where the tasks don't necessarily coincide? And anyone can feel free to respond.
I can jump on that. True, collectives make the struggle a lot easier. Of course, if you have 100 co-workers, there's got to be 5 you can talk to and convince them, et cetera, et cetera. If you work at home or if you are an Uber driver, that complicates things a whole lot. Because what do? I drive my car the whole day, in and out, and I don't see anybody. I see clients, but I don't see workers. Despite the fact we have pretty good organizing drives on the way. We have a pretty decent IDG, Independent Drivers Guild organization here in the city of Chicago and suburbs going on, organizing delivery workers, Uber, Lyft, etc. It's a union. They are a union. It's a union of independent contractors, ridiculous as it may sound. As a union of individuals who work individually. But social media is social media. That helps a lot. We have, not a union unfortunately, but we have a pretty strong movement here in the city of Chicago of domestic workers. Domestic workers meaning nannies, meaning people who clean houses, homes, and people who walk dogs, and people who take care of the sick, the elderly, etc. Those are individual workers too. They work, by themselves, one, maybe 2 by 2, cleaning a house. But we have such a great movement that we got something in Chicago no one else has: the right to have a contract in writing. If you go get hired anywhere, you won't get a contract in writing, a written contract. Well, domestic workers in the city of Chicago have that. It's mandatory for employers to have a written contract for domestic workers, establishing all the working conditions. So it is possible. It is absolutely possible. It depends on creativity. It depends on so many things. Make use of everything you have. Social media is fantastic. We do TikTok. We do labor TikTok, and it's good. 3-minute videos on labor and labor rights and labor issues. Do 3-minute TikToks. Of course, I like reading, like twice a year in these times, 30,000 word articles. Yeah, I love them. It's a good feeling. But it's a lot better if you do a 3-minute TikTok video, for workers, explaining something in plain and simple language, something that everybody can understand.
Go ahead. Yeah, the question. Did you want to answer?
Yeah, I actually did kind of want to answer. I guess would be I guess it kind of on the one level, it's I feel sort of working at home kind of situation kind of affects mostly petty bourgeois, rather than workers directly, I guess. So I guess that would kind of be a partial response, but also it's you kind of need it highlights sort of the need for organizations outside of unions and that kind of thing to be able to advocate the demands of working people. So during the pandemic, it's a lot of people aren't represented by unions, and you need sort of you need time off, you need extra pay, that kind of thing, just to get through the year. It's you can frame these in terms of political demands if you have elected representatives and that kind of thing, and a larger party to advocate for those demands, to advocate those political demands, so you don't end up with a situation where a bunch of workers are forced not to work and then they don't have any kind of pay whatsoever. They can at least get some kind of pay during that time because they have people advocating on their behalf in the House of Representatives or Senate and that kind of thing, and pushing for their demands specifically. Instead, yeah.
I'd like to also address this question. It's more difficult in some situations than others. So you have to be creative and so forth. But I want to answer 2 other questions in that fit into this one. People not in unions, people not traditionally in unions, and the question that was asked to you, but what do you do with 2 Democrats that you want to vote in a certain way? And Jorge will be quite familiar with this. In 2006, there was a Republican in the White House. There was a Republican majority in both the House and the Senate, houses of Congress. And it looked like there was going to be a very anti-immigrant bill, an attack against immigrants. Well, this was in 2006, and it was early in 2006. Look at the smile on his face. You want to tell the rest of the story?
In December 15, Republican Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner was able to pass a law in the lower house, a bill saying pretty much that anyone without immigration documents in the United States should be a federal criminal. It would become a federal crime. And not only them, but anyone who in any way helped them. Meaning a teacher teaching an undocumented student would be automatically a federal criminal. The school bus driver, driving that kid's school would be a criminal. The nurse, the doctor, the social worker, everybody who interacts with immigrants. And it passed in the House, and it went to the Senate, but the Senate went out on vacation. So we organized, and by March 2006, we got 350,000 people out in the street in the city of Chicago. And by May 1st of that year, we had 1 million people marching in the streets of Chicago against that bill. It has not happened. 16 years have passed, and they have not been able to do that. Not even Trump could do that. Nobody. I mean, of course, Barack Obama in the middle deported 3.5 million people, but that bill didn't pass. And that we got without social media, because Facebook didn't exist in 2006. But we got it by word of mouth, by radio. Nowadays, social media has an incredible reach. You can pretty much have your own radio station and your own radio programs and YouTube and I don't know what. So that it is possible to do so many things.
Yeah, I just want to make another comment on what you're describing. And that is, we're talking about labor issues of workers and so forth. The immigrant rights issue, the issue of workers without papers, is a workers' issue. It's not something different. This is something that's critical to the working class as a whole and should be seen that way.
So a bit of housekeeping. We started about 15 minutes late. I was thinking maybe we had time for one more question and opening or closing remarks, or do I have to cut it off? I mean, how are you guys? One more question and then, okay, all right, well, go ahead.
Maybe this can be, you can include your closing remarks in this too, because it's, I guess, related to the last question in the prompt, which was the relationship of the left to labor unions. So there seemed to be sort of a consensus that perhaps the task now is to build the workers' movement, right? And historically, this wasn't really seen as like the task of like socialists or Marxists. Like in the Second International, right? Marxists could sort of presuppose that civil society would organize itself, and they had a different intervention to make rather than just like building the labor movement. And like Myra and Les, you sort of rejected this category of like the left, right? And maybe held up like the party instead. You said like we don't yet have a party, but like we need one, Myra.
Yeah.
So I guess I want to ask maybe about the relationship of like a hypothetical party to like assuming a workers' movement and assuming a party. I'd like to ask what you all think about the relationship between these things. Like I'm thinking of like Rosa Luxemburg in the mass strike. In the last chapter on labor unions, she emphasizes like the necessity of the non-identity of like the party with labor unions, right? The importance of these being two distinct things versus like, I'm thinking of like Stalinism and like the Stalinized communist parties, especially in like the third period, right? Where you see much more of like heavy-handed direct control of like labor unions by communist parties. There's sort of a collapse of like the party and civil social organizations in the state all into sort of the same thing, right? So I guess I want to ask about what sort of relationship is desirable, either like right now or in the future, like assuming a labor movement, assuming like a socialist party.
And I think we will wrap that into final remarks. So maybe if you could use that pretty well articulated question as your prompt for the final remarks. It's 4 o'clock now. We had about a 15-minute game delay, so somewhere around 5 minutes apiece should be keeping us on time.
So,
yeah, I kind of just straightforwardly, I don't think like we can talk about civil society as a separate thing from the political, or like sort of just the political sphere entirely. I don't think we can even talk about that anymore to a large extent, and I think it's kind of like a theoretical error that like sort of like is like sort of there from like Marx's like critique of philosophy of right. I think it's kind of like a theoretical error there. And through the kind of practice of the Second International itself, through like the practice of the SPD, it's like it kind of like becomes evident that like the bourgeois society, sort of like capitalism doesn't necessarily like build these kind of civil society institutions by itself. Like the SPD itself built like all these fundamental alternatives to like civil society that currently already existed through like sort of like liberal political efforts and that kind of thing, and like built these kind of like alternatives and then like sort of even more civil society efforts through like the party and through that connection with the party. And like it sort of created almost an entire sort of like alternative society to like capitalist society within its own. And I guess what I'm trying to articulate here is like socialists have to like build the unions that they want to see. They have to build the workers' movement directly, and like to do that they need to like be able to sort of like change the rules of the game, change like labor laws and that kind of thing. And in order to directly do that, they need to put, again, politics in command, putting this sort of like efforts, useful efforts that we can do in terms of like running candidates, not just in like the Democratic Party, but in the Republican Party, independents and that kind of thing, to pursue like electoral reform, to pursue better labor laws and that kind of thing, and to work towards creating the party that will allow us to, essentially like merge what exists of the labor movement, what exists of the workers' movement, into a socialist movement together.
Want to go?
yes. I've made the point a number of times that I don't consider myself a leftist. And I want to go a little bit into that from a theoretical perspective. And when I was young, my family, a working class family, not everything was smooth. And my mother left my father for a short while and moved into a rooming house. And this rooming house happened to be a divided up old mansion. And the room we got happened to be the library of this mansion. And it had a whole bunch of anti-labor books from the late 19th century in there. And I just love reading. And it was like, it was funny. There's people with, basically predicting the end of the world. But since then, there's been a more serious thing that's happened. Not to me, but in the world from the perspective of politics. And that's the Russian Revolution. And it scared the fucking shit out of the ruling classes of the world. And from then on, and it took a while to build up, is they built up a juggernaut of an ideological onslaught against the idea of workers being able to run any kind of society. Now, this has been sophisticated. A big part of it is from this university, but Harvard and a whole lot of other places too, Yale. It is quite sophisticated, and the movements that we call socialist or whatever, for the most part, have no or very little connection to the working class. It's just a fact. And what this means is that the ideology, the pervasive ideology of the ruling class, takes hold in the left. And the left is basically, in so many issues, reflects the liberal wing of the capitalist class. And part of that is reform of capitalism. That, hey, things are bad, we got to stop doing this and do this instead. But what Marx taught us and what Lenin believed and subsequent revolutionaries, and it's very true today, is that capitalism has to be ended. It is going to kill us all as a civilization, etc. Whether it's nuclear war, the environment, or just other wars. I mean, the biggest war since World War II is going on in Europe right now, and they're threatening nuclear weapons. So it is urgent that the working class understand this, not be swayed by ruling class ideology. And what I'm saying, the working class is being, what we're discussing here, a lot of it is a ruling class ideology that we're talking about telling workers what is what. And we really have to go to the point of finding out from workers that find themselves in struggles, what are their issues, and generalize from that, and just pass the word that this struggle is happening, support it, etc. So that's what I really want to say, is the left is not the answer. So I think this panel is framed totally wrong. And I think the ruling class, the ideology, has infected the left very substantially. A lot of it's through universities, labor professors, and all sorts of things. But the working class itself, individuals in the working class, are capable of understanding the most complex issues, whether it's technology or philosophy, politics. The worst person I ever want to run into, or want to see a worker run into, is a PhD. Excuse me if I offend anybody here. A PhD in political science. They're subjected to a PhD in political science. If they listen to them, that ruins their politics. They will not be able to think straight for the rest of their lives.
You're bad.
I was invited here, so and I don't know what anybody
As
expected.
a guest, you have the right to say that. No, it's okay.
That's
I think we have to be incredibly clear on the difference between a political party and a labor union and the labor movement. A political party is an organization to win elections and to eventually take over the government or have enough power within a government, a state, as to decide what happens in a country. And you don't win elections by going to picket lines. A party can support a union, and a union can support a party. But the party is mainly there to win elections. And elections, you know how we win elections. Vote by vote, polling place by polling place, door by door, and money by money by money. But it's a different function, completely different function. Of course, in the left, we tend to believe that the party would be this incredibly massive organization that is going to succeed just because it has hundreds of thousands or millions of people. I am a federal congressman from Morena, the movement of national, how do you translate that? Movimiento de Regeneración Nacional, Regeneration National Movement, whatever, is the center-left, liberal, democratic party in Mexico, without a doubt, because the other ones are right and right and ultra-right wings. So Morena's got 2.8 million people today, and it's got the presidency and it's got majority in both chambers. That doesn't make Mexico a revolutionary country. That doesn't make the government a revolutionary government. It doesn't. The virtue of Morena is that it grew up out of movements, social movements, among them labor movements. Labor movements rebelling against the other political parties. Because it used to be in Mexico that the only party in power for 70 years, the revolutionary, institutional revolutionary party, co-opted the labor movement. And in every legislature, there would be 20 seats for union leaders. So every president of every labor union in Mexico got to be a congressman or got to be a senator or got to alternate first a congressman and then a senator and then back to being a congressman on top of being the president of a major labor union. But still, functions are different. Labor unions are, again, as I began, to address the main immediate concerns of workers, which is working conditions, wages, safety in the workplace, insurance, health coverage, and whatnot. And parties are, political instruments to take over. So what do we have here in City Council? 6 socialists. We are the City Council with more socialists in the whole United States. More than 10%. Fantastic. Maybe next year we can add a couple more. Yeah, that doesn't make a big difference, neither in the ruling party, the Democratic Party, or in labor unions. It doesn't make a difference. It's making a difference at the level, geographic level by district, and that's fine. But it's making a difference also because one of these socialist council members happens to be the one in the district of El Milagro. So we have El Milagro workers meeting at the office of the socialist councilman, Byron Siccho. And you start crisscrossing influences and ideas and support and whatnot. And the movement goes on. The movement just goes on, and nobody will stop it. Thank you.
All right, thank you guys, appreciate it.